Opening the queen's diagonal immediately claims central space and prepares development. Developing the knight to its most natural square, immediately contesting the center, and preparing further queenside expansion. Developing a knight here prepares for castling and exerts influence on the central squares, a fundamental principle of opening play. Establishing central presence, d5 challenges white's early kingside development and opens avenues for black's pieces. Challenging black's central pawn immediately, white seeks to disrupt harmony and create dynamic imbalances. Solidifying the center with e6 reinforces the d5 pawn, setting up a potential queen's gambit decline structure, ready for pawn breaks and piece development. Reinforcing the center's structure, this knight solidifies central control and prepares for potential pawn advances, while also eyeing black's queenside. Liberating central tension, black embraces a dynamic pawn sacrifice to immediately open lines for active piece development and potential counterplay. Reclaiming the central pawn offers a welcome pawn majority in the center and initiates development, aiming for harmonious piece placement. Preparing a queenside expansion with b5, this maneuver also prevents white's bishop from influencing key central squares. Claiming the queenside with this pawn thrust aims to prevent black's bishop from finding comfortable squares and could later open the queenside for white's own pieces, but beware of creating weaknesses. Preparing to challenge the central control and establish a queenside fianchetto, this move boldly outlines a plan to counter white's pawn chain and potentially open diagonals for the bishop. Reclaiming that central pawn solidifies your space and opens lines for your other pieces, preparing for a swift development. Developing the bishop to b7 directly addresses the tension on the c-file and prepares to contest white's powerful bishop on c4, creating an active diagonal presence and reinforcing the queenside structure against potential pawn pushes. Finally, bringing the king to safety, this maneuver secures the monarch amidst the developing skirmish, simultaneously preparing to activate the rook on the h1a8 diagonal, a crucial long-term positional goal. Unpinning the knight from the central pawn opens up attacking possibilities on the d4 square, while simultaneously preparing to castle and consolidate pieces. Initiating a subtle regrouping, the queen elegantly steps to a square that shores up the kingside and prepares for potential central breakthroughs, while simultaneously eyeing the undeveloped queenside, hinting at a strategic shift towards active piece play and asserting influence over key diagonals. Securing the king safely away from the center's storm ensures a solid foundation for developing the remaining pieces and preparing for central operations. Opening the d-file with the rook now prepares to contest central control, potentially forcing concessions from black's pawn structure or creating opportunities to exert pressure along that open lane. Nurturing the knight towards its natural outpost on f6, while simultaneously preparing for a potential exchange sacrifice on c3, demonstrates a subtle yet active approach to unifying black's pieces and bolstering its central presence, hinting at future tactical possibilities. Developing the bishop to d3 solidifies control over the d-file and prepares to exert pressure on black's queenside development, particularly targeting the c6 square if opportunities arise. Black challenges the center's structure with a bold pawn thrust, aiming to liberate their queenside pawns and disrupt white's comfortable development by immediately creating dynamic counterplay in the central files. Reaching for control of the central dark squares, the knight repositions to support an eventual e4 push, subtly preparing to contest the now open c-file. Seeking to dislodge the bishop from its commanding diagonal and potentially gain a tempo, black repositions the piece to a5, a subtle shift that simultaneously prepares for future pawn advances on the queenside while eyeing potential targets on the c3 knight. Finally, embracing the central tension, white seizes the opportunity to simplify and clarify the board's structure. Reclaiming the central pawn tension is paramount. By recapturing with the pawn, black solidifies their central presence and maintains a symmetrical pawn structure, avoiding any immediate weaknesses while preparing for a more active piece development. Injecting central dynamism, White boldly stakes a claim for the d5 square, directly challenging black's pawn chain and preparing to activate the king's bishop. Black asserts control over the critical central dark squares and prepares to challenge white's central pawn presence. White sidesteps a potential pawn race and solidifies his structure, preventing black's knight from hopping into b4 while simultaneously creating a small shield for his king. Reclaiming the central file and preparing to challenge white's control over the d-file signifies black's intention to inject dynamism into a somewhat static position. This maneuver not only adds pressure on d4, but also potentially opens avenues for the queen to join the kingside assault or support a d5 pawn push later on. Unleashing a bishop to pin the knight on f6 immediately ratchets up the pressure, aiming to exploit the cramped position of black's queenside pieces and potentially disrupt their pawn structure should the knight be forced to move. Black boldly places the knight on e5, a significant outpost, aiming to disrupt white's central ambitions and potentially threaten the vulnerable d3 bishop. This maneuver simultaneously prepares for a kingside pawn push or repositions the knight for a future attack on the d-file, creating dynamic imbalances. White aims to solidify the bishop's position on a safer diagonal and prepare for potential central expansion, while also unpinning the knight on c3 and possibly activating the queen on the c-file should it open. Initiating the exchange of rooks immediately addresses the open d-file and aims to simplify the position, potentially steering towards an endgame where the opponent's bishop pair might become less of a decisive advantage. Repossessing the open file, white reclaims the d-file with authority, aiming to leverage this territorial advantage for future central penetration. The exchange of rooks simplifies the position, potentially hastening a transition towards an endgame where the control of this crucial diagonal will become paramount, and the knight on a2 might find its long-range prospects diminished. This exchange immediately simplifies the position, offering black a chance to rectify some structural weaknesses by trading off white's actively placed knight. The immediate consequence is the opening of the b-file for white's rook, but more importantly, it eliminates white's attacker of the d5 pawn and removes a key defender of white's king. The critical question now becomes whether black can exploit the newfound semi-open diagonal for their bishop and pressure white's less developed queenside. Recapturing with the queen reasserts central influence and prepares for queenside play, though it also signals a potential simplification as exchanges loom on the king's flank. Initiating a calculated repositioning, the knight embarks on a circuitous journey to bolster the kingside pawn structure and potentially challenge white's dominant central presence. Unlocking the bishop's diagonal, white aims to activate this piece and potentially pressure black's queenside pawns. The immediate tension on the light squares, where black's bishop is no longer defended by its knight, hints at potential tactical opportunities arising from this repositioning. Consider how this bishop's placement might influence future pawn breaks or create a strong outpost for white. Notice the delicate balance of control over central squares and how this move subtly shifts it. This redirection prepares for further piece development, possibly involving a knight transfer or an assault on the kingside. Unyielding pressure on the queenside is the aim as black shores up defenses, preparing for a potential queenside expansion while white consolidates. Seizing the open file with this rook thrust immediately challenges black's centralized queen and aims to disrupt their coordination, creating long-term pressure and potentially opening up critical lines for further piece activity. The queen retreats, acknowledging the pressure on the c-file while preparing to redeploy to a less exposed square, potentially the e-file, aiming to bolster the beleaguered kingside defenses. A subtle repositioning aimed at challenging black's central control, preparing for potential pawn advances or reinforcing the kingside. A bold attempt to redirect the knight towards the kingside, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses there. Unleashing the kingside pawn, white immediately disrupts black's harmonious knight development and seeks to exploit the newly opened e-file, creating dynamic play and potential threats around the black king, while simultaneously opening lines for the rooks. This bold bishop sortie immediately challenges white's central dominance, aiming to disrupt the harmonious development and potentially create an outpost on d3. White aims to untangle their pieces and prepare for further central pawn advancements, while simultaneously eyeing the compromised light squares around Black's king. Striking the bishop pair, Black initiates a sequence that simplifies the board, aiming to capitalize on White's slightly awkward queen placement. A decisive opening of the center, shattering Black's pawn structure for immediate material gain and a critical advantage in tempo. The ensuing exchanges promise to unleash White's pieces with devastating effect. White bravely sacrifices a pawn to rip open lines directly towards the Black king. This calculated risk aims to exploit Black's currently uncoordinated pieces and exposed monarch. The immediate consequence is a potent attack that Black will struggle to defend effectively. White is betting on the speed of development and the vulnerability of Black's king. The opening of the e-file and g-file will soon become White's primary avenues of assault. Hoping to untangle the messy position, Black aims to create active piece play by repositioning the bishop to a more dynamic square, though the knight on f6 remains a potential target for White's advancing pawns. Unlocking the f-file's potential, this pawn sacrifice carves a dangerous path toward Black's castled king, aiming to shatter its defensive structure and initiate a decisive attack. This pawn push boldly stakes a claim on the queen side and seeks to disrupt White's development, though it potentially weakens the light squares around Black's king should White manage to penetrate. Opening up the c-file for potential future pressure on the queen, a move aiming to simplify the position while maintaining some initiative. The queen's foray to c5, while seemingly active, risks becoming a target on an open file, potentially inviting White's pieces to converge and create immediate pressure around the Black king. Sharpening the attack, White introduces an aggressive queen maneuver, threatening to pry open the queen side and gain a critical tempo by forcing Black's bishop back or into a potentially vulnerable square. A decisive exchange on e5, Black voluntarily sacrifices pawn equality for the chance to untangle their pieces, aiming to exploit the open c-file and potentially pressure White's less developed queenside. This transition suggests an endgame consideration where Black's active rook and bishop might pose threats, while White must be vigilant against pawn weaknesses developing on their own side of the board. Capturing the bishop on c2 radically alters the pawn structure, creating isolated pawns for Black on the c-file and potentially opening lines for White's rooks down the future d-file if Black doesn't manage them well. Black seeks to untangle its bishop from its current predicament, potentially creating counterplay on the queen side after recapturing the pawn. Seizing the file now presents a tempting opportunity for White to disrupt Black's queenside structure and potentially create weaknesses, though it does leave the rook somewhat exposed and out of play for the moment. Conceding the open file to the rook feels like a significant positional concession, potentially offering White increased control over the vital c-file in the ensuing exchanges and beyond. Reclaiming the bishop solidifies White's material advantage, now facing an endgame where Black's scattered pawns present exploitable weaknesses, particularly on the queen side after the exchange. Your king, now exposed on g7, faces significant pressure as White's bishop eyes the long diagonal. Asserting control over the queen side, the pawn push aims to restrict Black's rook and potential breakthroughs, creating a distant passed pawn situation. The king cautiously steps out, aiming to escape the cramped queen side and find a more active post, perhaps eyeing the central squares and seeking to connect the remaining pawns. Pivoting the knight to the edge here opens up the possibility of repositioning it to a more active square, aiming to exploit the slightly misplaced Black king by creating infiltration threats and potentially attacking the weak pawn on c4 if the opportunity arises. Bringing the king to the center suddenly becomes a calculated risk, seeking to activate it for the ensuing pawn endgame while White's remaining pieces are somewhat uncoordinated. Shifting the knight to the edge of the board creates a fascinating dynamic, offering potential outpost possibilities or a surprise maneuver towards the king side while preparing to redeploy to a more active square. Navigating the endgame's shifting sands, Black seeks to activate the rook on the 7th rank, a potential disruptor in White's entrenched position. Unleashing a surprise attack on the rook, This initiative aims to disrupt black's carefully constructed pawn structure and exploit the exposed monarch, potentially forcing concessions or tactical exposure. The rook's repositioning to the 8th rank aims to solidify control of the open file, potentially creating future counterplay or defending against encroaching white pieces, while the king subtly shuffles away from the bishop's diagonal and central activity. Clearing the path for the queenside pawns to advance is the immediate goal, forcing a decision on how black intends to defend their remaining pawn structure. Initiating the king's active deployment is crucial now, aiming to centralize it for potential defensive duties or even as an attacking piece in the latter stages of this pawn-heavy scenario. Sacrificing the knight to force a king chase across the board opens up a dynamic endgame where white aims to corner the black monarch using the remaining pawns. Relocating the king to a safer corner, albeit a bit late, offers a sliver of hope against the dominant rook and knight presence. Activating the bishop to an aggressive post, the move seeks to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially infiltrate on the queenside while guarding against any counterplay along the 7th rank. The rook finds itself in a precarious position, now exposed to the opposition's advanced pawn. The knight's repositioning now aims to restrict the enemy king's options as the pawns are being exchanged. Initiating a pawn march with the rook's support, aiming to displace the enemy king further and potentially activate the a-pawn as a passed threat, though it also exposes the bishop to immediate pressure. Opening the queenside for your rook's infiltration to control the entire side of the board is the primary objective here. Securing the file with the rook forces white to decide whether to allow black complete dominance of this open column or to engage in awkward exchanges that might weaken his pawn structure. Unlocking the power of the bishop pair is paramount now. The exchange of queens has simplified the position significantly, and this maneuver aims to reposition the bishop to a more active square, aiming to create threats on the king side or support potential pawn advances. Securing the b5 square with the king establishes a more resilient defensive perimeter, anticipating potential disruptions along the rank and preparing for a unified defense of the remaining pawns. Redirecting the knight to a square where it can influence the queenside majority and prepare a pawn push provides a fresh attacking vector after the recent exchanges. Snatching that pawn at b4 seems tempting, a real grab for material, but it opens up a precarious path for your king into the heart of white's remaining forces, potentially turning a material gain into a dangerous positional concession. Activating the knight to its optimal outpost after the pawn exchange solidifies white's initiative and prepares for potential breakthroughs. Pushing the pawn forward now creates a significant spatial dilemma for white's knight, forcing it to a passive defensive position and opening up the crucial c-file for potential future penetration. King hunting begins. This move forces the black monarch into a precarious corner, aiming to exploit its exposed position with the knight's attacking potential. The black king is now exposed to the full might of white's knight and bishop battery on the queen side, a perilous situation that demands immediate defensive repositioning. The knight's foray offers a tantalizing check, forcing the black king into a precarious position on an open square. Navigating towards the queen side, black repositions the king, seeking shelter behind its pawns and preparing to connect the remaining pieces for potential counterplay, a necessary maneuver given the exposed nature of its monarch in the center. Initiating the retreat of the knight to its starting square, a cautious maneuver to avoid the pawn's advance and prepare for a potential repositioning, perhaps aiming for the king side if the opportunity arises. The pawn's determined push to the 2nd rank suddenly injects a dynamic element, threatening to become a disruptive force if left unchecked. Unleashing a fork, the knight targets the king and rook, aiming to dismantle black's remaining structural integrity and force material concessions. King hunting has officially commenced as the monarch seeks sanctuary but finds the board shrinking, the rook's looming presence on the 7th rank, a stark reminder of its unchecked power, now threatens to squeeze the life out of any remaining opposition. Initiating a king march to safety, this move prepares to reposition your monarch from its exposed central position, a crucial step as the board simplifies. Sacrificing the bishop opens a critical diagonal for the king's safety, forcing white into a defensive posture and creating a desperate situation with the passed pawn on c2. Navigating into the unknown territory of the king's final defense, this placement on e1 aims to consolidate the monarch's security amidst the encroaching enemy cavalry and the persistent pawn structure. The pawn's determined march finally culminates, transforming into a queen and delivering the decisive blow that seals the king's fate.